the board of Reform Scotland for a number of years as well, and the work that Reform Scotland does, I think, is highly important. I've been involved in politics. I was 15 years a council leader, and sometimes politics is far too partisan. It's far too partisan, and a party brings up an idea, it's rubbish because it's from another party, and it's never been my politics, never will be. And some of the things that we discussed tonight, I've discussed with other colleagues from other parties, and they're keen to work with them on that. So my background, as I said, was 15 years as a local councillor and as a council leader. Before that, I was in the Bank of Scotland and business and corporate banking as well, so trying to understand it from that point of view. And it's fair to say that I've been in the job now about a year. It's been a challenging year. It's been the most humbling year of my life, I have to say, and I think the mention about how important housing is, I'm glad to see now that it's higher up the political agenda, because it's never been there for a long period of time. So I'm glad that that's there, and I think that's incredibly important as we move forward. So it's great to see so many here tonight, and I want to talk around about how we secure more investment. I think that's incredibly important, how we boost partnership working, and I'll touch on that. And obviously it's towards the common goal of delivering more homes for the people of Scotland. Obviously, since the budget was announced, there has been feedback, I have to say. People have been very open and frank about that, and one of the key things I think for me tonight is please be open and frank. Sugarcoat this, be open and frank, tell me what I need to know in terms of this. I've tried in the year I've been in to try and meet as many people as possible. There's lots of people I've met in the room here today, and I will continue to do that. That's always going to be my goal in terms of that. Whether I'm here in 2 years, 7 years, or whatever, I want to leave a legacy. This is not about just thinking about the edges. This is about systemic change that housing needs in Scotland, but in the rest of the UK as well, and I think that's really important. So I mentioned about being here about a year. I visited projects, and it's important. This isn't just about urban Scotland, it's about rural Scotland as well. There's different partnerships, it's all tenure, and Jane and I have had that chat as well. It's about an all tenure approach. This isn't just about local authorities, RSLs, it's obviously around about working with the sector as well in terms of that. And I have heard of the first hand about the difference that homes I've made. So as I said, I'm really keen to try and pick up obviously feedback from yourselves, and again I'll touch on and about how we bring that all together. So housing of the right type, as Chris has said, in the right place is obviously to meet identified local needs, can have an immensely powerful and generational impact. And since I've been in the post, housing can't sit alone, doesn't sit alone. It plays a really important part in wider economic regeneration. And I met Willie Hockey just before Christmas, and the work that Willie's doing around that and economic regeneration in the Gorbals and other areas, I think is incredibly important. Other opportunities, for example, we're talking about the renewable hubs in Scotland. There are around about 7 or 8 renewable hubs in Scotland, so I've been speaking to SSCN and Spen around about how we can turn around about, first of all, the temporary accommodation needs for workers, but how can we then turn around about the legacy opportunities with that. And just before we come in, we had a chat with Matthew, we were talking around about opportunities, for example, around about Forth Ports and how we can work with them as well. So there are different models that are out there, and I'm open to discussing these. I'll talk around about how we bring these together in a little while, but I think that's an incredibly important part. The Housing 2040 strategy is obviously talking around about how we get access to safe, warm and affordable and good quality home, and there's a few people that are on the board here, and I have to say, probably in the last 5 years we've been talking about housing. It's almost at the perfect storm in terms of that. We've had interest rates, we've had cost of living, we've had the Ukrainian situation, we're trying to house around about 25,000 Ukrainian families, and I was talking to Edinburgh Council just earlier on today, talking about the pressures that's put on Edinburgh in terms of that as well. So there have been real challenges. It's a perfect storm that's come in terms of ours, and in a way that's pushed the housing up the agenda, but it's good because we need to discuss housing a lot more in terms of that. Now, I know people will be asking around about when the new housing bill will be coming in. I can't mention that. It's shortly, that's all I can say. It's shortly. For obviously ministerial code, I can't mention that. And obviously that's talking about a deal for tenants, so the introduction of long-term rent control for the private sector. And I've met institutional investors down in London and online in terms of how we can make sure we maximise the need for affordable rent, but also doesn't negate the opportunities for institutional investment. And one of the key things as well with housing is how it's introducing measures to how we prevent homelessness. So before I want to look forward, I kind of want to look back to some of the origins and some of the challenges we face. The right to buy policy, I can remember that kind of going through, obviously took 500,000 homes out of the social rented sector after its introduction in 1980. Obviously that was stopped, the buy-to-let policy, and that's kept a number of houses that are there. Scotland does well in terms of, if we're talking about the number of houses that have been built, but it's now slowing down. I think last year was the highest year in terms of delivery, but in terms of completions and starts, I think that's incredibly important. And again, I'll touch on some of these issues. Since 2007, Scotland has seen over 40% more affordable homes delivered per head of population in England and 70% more in Wales. But we need to do more. We need to do more. And I think that's really important. So that's good, and I say we need to do better in terms of attracting investment and for housing. The key thing, obviously, with the budgetary issues that's coming out, I've been working and we've got Joe Brown here from the Scottish Government for more homes. This was one of the key issues that I picked up as soon as I became Minister. We need to attract more investment into Scotland. How do we do that? I want Scotland the most attractive place to invest in housing. I've set myself that target. I've mentioned on a number of occasions in terms of that. Now that's a combination of MMR, it's a combination of BTR, but it's also social housing, and there are models out there in terms of all of them to look at that. So as I said, I want to make Scotland the most attractive place to invest in housing, and I want to work with yourselves on that. Now, I've got to acknowledge at this moment there are extreme pressures on housing systems. There are extreme pressures on homelessness, and we just need to look at pressures in Edinburgh and Glasgow. In terms of that, I met Edinburgh just today, met Edinburgh last week also, met Glasgow today. So there's a little bit, to say about budgets and empty homes before returning to investment. The budget, obviously, we've seen a 10% cut, a real terms cut in our capital funding. One of the biggest issues we faced, and so many people know that, would be there was a 62% cut, around about £290 million in financial transactions. Financial transactions gives us the ability to be a bit more flexible in trying to attract investment into that area. Brexit's obviously had an issue on supply chain, labour shortages, and obviously inflationary pressures that we've seen kind of coming through. So that's kind of looking around about looking back. I think obviously there are three main themes I think the government has. Obviously it's tackling poverty, it's opportunity in terms of growing the economy and community that we're talking about as well. So I know the budget's been cut, and I'll face up to that one, and I know I had, let's say, open and frank discussions with some stakeholders on that particular point and continue to do so. The one key thing I think for me is to say, in terms of the grant programme, this isn't the institutional investment and additional investment is not to replace the addition. I want to grow the grant model, and one of the key things that I'll be asking of any new incoming government is I don't have the ability to borrow to build more houses. I don't have that ability. Any other house minister in Europe has that ability to go out and do that. So I think it's not just a political point, there is a business point behind this. It pays for itself. Now we will develop in that case and taking that to UK government in that regard, because I think that's incredibly important. If I had the ability to borrow, we'd be building a lot more houses and adding that additional investment that brings. And I think one of the key things that Jane mentioned as well in terms of that, the houses, house building attracts, it's about £4 to £5 billion a year adds to the GVA of our economy. The 110,000 target we had, if it's achievable, adds £18 billion to GVA. So housing in itself is fantastic, it gives homes, but it's also a key economic driver in terms of that. One of the key things I talked around about as well was in terms of the charitable bonds, and we talked about financial transactions. There's £50 million of charitable bonds this year to augment the Affordable Housing Supply Programme, and that's obviously delivering social low-income homes through housing associations. The further donations will be available in the next financial year, so that's going to tackle the pressure on the budgets in 24-25. Now, some of the key issues and how we tackle homelessness, and some of it is around about obviously empty homes themselves. Now, there are a huge number of empty homes in Scotland for complex reasons, for different reasons. We've been working really closely with the Empty Homes Partnership. There are also a number of voids issues, and again, I know in terms of that, Edinburgh, for example, has 1,500 voids, and we've talked about, you and I talked about this, how do we focus on getting some of the voids back and can tackle that. Now, these are some of the easier measures to look at that. So we talked about empty homes. Tackling empty homes is really important, and they have got a real role to addressing housing need and homelessness, depopulation, obviously, in terms of that. The Scottish Government has invested £3.2 million in the partnership, in the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership, and that's brought around about 9,000 empty homes back into active use. So I'm pleased to announce that this year there's a further 423,000 to support this important work in the year ahead, and part of that will obviously go to local authorities. And that's a sound investment. The Independent Order of Empty Homes carried out this year and last year endorses our approach. So I wanted to kind of talk around about other partnerships that are there before I talk about the investment in terms of that. So there's other, obviously I talked about the empty homes, and there's some projects, for example, we've seen in Dundee and in Perth, and the difference that's made. I was up in Dundee last week talking to them and meeting Ukrainian residents that have settled in Edinburgh, and that's made a huge difference. In Argyll and Bute, there's a partnership between the council and the Health and Social Care Partnership, which will see empty homes brought back in. And of course, one of the key things I think for me being a local councillor was getting round all the local authorities. I think I've got about 4 to go. And each local area is completely different to each, and its own complex in terms of that. So I think there are key things that we've tried to look at around about local authorities getting the powers about council tax treatment of second homes. There's short-term lets issues as well, bringing in control areas in terms of that. So again, we're trying to increase the ability to do that. But the key thing for me talking about it is about innovative finance, and I think that's one of the key things when I came into the role was exploring the opportunities around about that. So we've had discussions with SNIB, we've had discussions about SFT, we've had discussions with Hub, talking around about that today, talking about that over the last number of months. So there are schemes being developed around about that, and I think I've made it clear that I want to accelerate the work with the financial community in Scotland and elsewhere to deliver more homes through innovative finance. And I've met institutional investors on a number of occasions down in London. We've got another meeting coming up. We've met online in terms of that today. Now, key partners, I think we've kind of talked about. We talked around about, like, for example, around about Forth Ports in Edinburgh, the Greenfree Ports. I was at a meeting, hosted a meeting up in Inverness, talking about the opportunities about that. They're talking about delivering 10 to 15,000 houses up there. So in the past, we've used innovative models to deliver affordable homes, and I want to build on that. Now, what we've kind of seen in the past is kind of projects, bits and pieces, and almost not strategic development of the sector, and I think that's really important. So yesterday we held a meeting with RSLs, talking around about opportunities. So Hubco presented to them, SFT presented to them around about some models that we're looking at. So there's a real willingness within the RSL sector to deliver that, so we'll be taking that work forward in terms of how we can look at, in terms of looking at these models, how we can get institutional investment coming in, and that today. And today we met local authorities, and again they were saying the same thing. Now there's a challenge to me around about the existing rules that are there, for example around about HRA, and how we can look at guarantees as well. I don't have powers over some of the guarantees, so that's something that we're looking to do to maximise that as well. And innovations, and we were just talking to a colleague here earlier on around about the model down in East Lothian, in my hometown in Dunbar, which included the use of a leasehold arrangement, and I know Gillian from the UK was part of that discussion as well, and the Scottish Government's charitable bond scheme, which involved loan funding and the use of equity funding and risk sharing. That didn't get any government subsidy. It was full allocation policies to the council, and made a real difference, and I've seen that in my own town in terms of that. So combining these public and private sources of funding has secured additional funds and created new investment opportunities for all. It's a win-win. It's absolutely a win-win. So, but there are other opportunities behind that as well. We need to scale up these on a regional scale. So the project in Dunbar was great. How do we scale that up? So I think probably just about 4 months ago I had a chat with the City Region team in Edinburgh, which obviously includes Edinburgh, Mid West, East Lothian and so on. There are about 7 or 8 strategic sites that are there. Now, East Lothian as well as other areas in the south east of Scotland are growing really quickly. So one of the key things we talked about, what, not just in housing, but what investment do we need to deliver that investment, because that will make a huge difference in there. So that's talking about infrastructure fund and so on. And that's somewhere where the Hubco model can come in terms of that as well. So they're preparing an investment prospectus in terms of that. We've had chats with Glasgow around about doing the same thing. The work I mentioned about SSEN, working with the renewable hubs, they're keen to invest and partner up with us on that matter as well. So it's trying to see how we can deliver these projects. So how do we scale up the projects that are there to a regional basis and to a national basis? And I think that's really important in terms of that, and there are discussions ongoing about that. So there remains many opportunities for investment, including public-private collaborations. As I said, I met Willie just before Christmas and keen to work with him in terms of how we can deliver and working with him in terms of that as well. Where does the risk sit? I think that's a really important part, and I think I visited Bertha Park that some of you might be aware of in Perth, which had institutional investors, it had RSLs, it had the local authority, it had the developer involved in that. And they looked at the shared model and they were talking about how to negate risk. There's a role for government in terms of that. How do we negate that risk? And that's possibly through guarantees, for example. And I think that's really important to mention that as well. So there are opportunities as well. I mentioned about the role of SFT, of SNIB, of Hubco and so on. There's also the Scottish Growth Scheme, and obviously I mentioned about the Scottish National Investment Bank before. So these are key players. So what do we do from here? And I think that's a really important point. So to drive that forward, and I've mentioned this to a few people, I'm pleased to tell you that I'm going to establish a new short-term life housing investment task force, and that's bringing people together from the sector, that'll bring people together from the government. We're also looking at deliverability of the 110,000 target, so again that will include the sector, and it's driven by the sector. So the task force will be, over the remainder of the year, focused on building investor confidence and attracting more investment into housing. It will help to unlock existing financial commitments and encourage and promote new delivery partnerships. Now, I would hope that when that's established, we'll be able to give a little bit more detail. So the remit membership will be announced shortly. We're looking to have the first meeting in the beginning of April. It will be, however, predicated on advice of the investor panel and recognise the vital importance of working with key lender and investor organisations. I've had chats with the SFE, for example, and about some of the work that they have, particularly with the RSLs in terms of covenants. I think that's an incredibly important part of that as well. So I want this task force, and as I said, it's driven by the sector to identify practical barriers to immediate action and make proposals to address these, looking at both longer term and shorter term solutions. So my ambition is to ensure that we can deliver more housing across all tenures, to ensure that everyone has access to a safe, quality and affordable home that meets their needs in the place they want to be. And key thing I think for me, I can do so much within government in delivering some of the housing and tackling homelessness. It needs that partnership approach for future success. Now that will require trust, mutual respect, effective communication, and obviously a shared understanding of goals and responsibilities, risks and rewards. Now, if I'm talking to institutional investors, they also want a return on investment. And I remember the key thing I mentioned to them when I went down and spoke to them in London was, give me your money, I'll give you the return on investment. And I think that's the key thing. They want to get a return on investment, and we've got to understand that. And how do we model that in terms of that? As I mentioned earlier, I'm keen to hear your voices, your advice, your ideas. I believe we have a shared ambition to make Scotland the most attractive place to invest in housing and deliver for communities. And I'll come back to the point, this isn't about tinkling about the edges. The housing system in Scotland needs systemic change. It needs absolute systemic change. And in the UK, the whole model across the UK and Scotland needs systemic change. In terms of how we finance it, what are the flexibilities, where are the guarantees, where are the risks. So it's not tinkling about the edges. I hope that, as I said, the Housing Investment Task Force, driven by the sector, chaired by the sector and co-chaired by myself, will produce some of the ideas, look at what we can try and do to take that forward. So I want us to embrace these lots of partnership, work together to achieve more, deliver more and secure a more prosperous, inclusive and sustainable future. And coming back to the point I mentioned, please be frank, please be open, please criticise if you need to criticise. That's what I'm here to pick up from you here tonight. But again, thanks Chris for inviting me. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Paul. Sounds like you're busy. A wee bit. There's a lot going on at high pace. I'm going to ask some easy questions to start before we get to your questions. But you talked about systemic change going on beyond 2 years or 7 years, whether you or your party are in government at that point. And I think maybe that's been one of the problems or one of the issues in Scotland, is that we've obviously had a one-party government for a long time now, as we have had at Westminster, and we have over the years and the decades in British politics. And there comes a point where change is probably coming, and trying to find those threads that take a good idea and deliver it over a few decades. We've been pretty bad at that in Britain. One good example of it I might put forward is education in England, where you had Kenneth Baker through to Andrew Adonis, through to Michael Gove, and on now, and whatever, where there was an idea of education, whether you agree with it or not, about how things should work, and it's had good consequences, maybe some bad ones, but good ones as well. We're not been very good at that in Scotland, maybe in part because of the constitutional divide, so there's been a real wrestling between what's willing to be accepted even outside of that constitutional divide. How do you deliver that systemic change working with people that aren't in the SNP and that might ultimately replace and will ultimately replace you in government, because no party stays in power forever? What's your approach to that?
I think there are a couple of things. One, in terms of coming into the post, one of the key things I established right at the start was meeting with my opposition spokespeople. So I meet with them on a monthly basis. So I'll be meeting with them talking about the housing bill, I'll be meeting with them talking around about the cladding bill, for example. And one of the key things for me, and we've already had chats around about, and I've been mentioned this in the Parliament a couple of times as well, is about the need for institutional investment. So I raise this and talk about this with colleagues. If we're taking forward this initiative, I want it to be supported right across the Parliament. That's I think is really important to me, that everybody does that. There'll always be politics. That's part of the job, but you need to move away from that. The key thing I think for me as well is talking, and it's Miles Briggs and Mark Griffin, who's my opposite numbers. We're also talking about, I'm also looking at what asks do we have of an incoming government. So if it's one of the key things, like when I talked about additional borrowing powers, which I think is really important, we've got to develop that business case. It's not just a political point, it's that business case for looking at that. the crisis report and the homelessness monitor talked about a couple of key issues. One was about the local housing allowance, which we've no control over, which is really important in tackling homelessness. But not just in homelessness, it's also important in terms of some of the issues we get in terms of investment. So that needs to be raised. So there are asks around about additional bond powers, there are asks about restoring the capital credit cap, but also asks around about, as I said, giving us powers, but local housing allowance and so on. So, but it's trying to work collaboratively on, and I think that's really important in terms of that. So I established that right at the start.
And how much agreement is there across the future of some of the things you've outlined tonight and the ambitions you have?
Yeah, if you look at some of the issues, there have been discussions around about empty homes, and the Conservative had some policies around about it. We're talking about how to get more investment into the sector. I think in terms of what we need to do, there's agreement in that regard. We know there's an issue right across the UK. I think in Scotland we recognise where some of the issues are, and I think I was speaking to Matthew just before we came in, and one of the things that Matthew said is about what levers have we got and how can we use them as effectively as possible. The Housing Investment Task Force will look at that and to see how we can develop these on a strategic level as best we possibly can. So I think there is agreement in terms of that. I'm happy to speak to, and I do speak to opposition spokespeople and that, and it's important for me that whether I get elected or not in 2 years' time, whether I'm here in 7 years' time.
The majority is quite slim, isn't it?
My majority is
117 or something like that.
Yeah. Nice to remind me. But,
Sorry.
We'll increase it next time. But, so there is that challenge. But the key thing I think, and I tried to be when you talked about the education discussion we had in East Lothian before, a lot of it was around about trying to build that in the local authority. So for me, it's very much trying to bring everybody on board. That's a political kind of thing. The key thing I mentioned about partnership work and speaking to a lot of people that we've got here tonight, and many I've met already. And how do you develop that? I need people to have confidence in me in terms of that. Now, in terms of budget cut, that probably went down a little bit. That probably came down a little bit in terms of that. But I need to make sure that people believe what I'm saying in terms of what they are, making sure that I'm seen as credible. And as a politician, I think that how people value politicians and look at politicians is going down, and quite rightly in some cases. But I need to build up that respect across the political spectrum, and I think I get that. But also build up in partnership and colleagues. People in these rooms, the people in these will help deliver what we need to deliver in Scotland.
Okay. You announced tonight a housing investment task force. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could just tell us a bit more about that, about the purpose of it, the membership of it, what the outcomes obviously the outcomes will be decided, but what kind of things you're thinking about?
I think the kind of thing, one, when I got into post, one of the key things was to try and attract additional investment into the sector. I think that was really important. I'd seen the model in East Lothian, for example, work, but it was to try to attract additional funding to come in there. And I remember when we had the meeting in October, people are keen to invest in Scotland. There's obviously the rent controls issue that's been talked about. And I think what was clear at the meeting we had was investors aren't against rent controls per se. It's how is it stacked up, what does it look like in terms of, and that was the message we got. Some would prefer not to have any, and there's countries like, for example, in Denmark and in Sweden where that kind of works. Now, there are good examples and bad examples about how that works, so it's learning from these to make sure we attract that investment can come in. The Housing Investment Task Force itself will be co-chaired by somebody from the sector. It will be predominantly from people from the institutional sector. I'll have RSL and input, I'll have housing investment input, and I was speaking to James before, it's going to have developer input into that as well, and it will be very much driven by the group itself, the task force itself.
What's the aim?
The aim is one is to identify the barriers, and we talked about that, and it comes back to the point I think that Matthew had said around about we've got some of the barriers that are here. How do we break them down? So if people want to invest in Scotland, what are the barriers that are there? How do we look at models that maybe haven't been thought around about just now? When we met with RSLs and local authorities in the last couple of days, there were specific questions. It's also looking at the role of, as I said, of government agencies. What's the role of SFT? What's the role of SNP? What's the role of some of the Scottish Growth Scheme in terms of that Hubco, for example? So there are different, can we focus more of their input into what to do to deliver housing? And because we need to deliver housing, not just for the sake, and I think it's an important thing is, yes, it's a roof over people's heads. It's a key economic driver. It is a key economic driver, and since I've got into post, it's trying to recognise that and what we need to do around about that. So it's looking at all these things. The group itself will discuss the remit and what it does and drive that forward. I talked about the deliverability review of the 110,000 target. That will involve the sector, including Homes for Scotland, including RSLs, including CIH, for example, and about what do we need to do. Things have changed in the last 4 or 5 years that haven't helped in terms of that. You know, if it's a perfect storm for housing, it's probably arrived here now, and in the UK and across the rest of Europe, to be fair. But it's looking at that about how the sector can feed in, and it feels like it's getting a voice. I think previously, before, we've had individual applications come in for individual kind of, I suppose, developments. But we need to look at it more strategic. How does that happen, and how does that work? And that'll be driving forward. So the investment task force, I think, gives us that strategic overview in terms of that, and it's driven by the sector. I think that's really important. Housing can be delivered by government itself, and I think respective governments have kind of thought that they've got the solutions. Needs to be driven by the sector itself, the investment sector, and obviously includes Homes for Scotland, RSLs, local authorities in terms of that. And it comes back, it's an all tenure approach. It can't just be one sector or another, so it's an all tenure approach. It needs to.
Okay, well, I think it's important that we hear tonight your thoughts and challenges to that, and we'll get to that. I suppose just going back a bit, you know, the Scottish Government's undershot its housing target for about a decade or more than a decade. So, you know, this problem's been building and building in terms of providing the number of houses that the population requires. You know, there really isn't anyone for the SNP to blame. I know you will blame Westminster, but you're not allowed to for this evening. But why are we falling further and further behind when we should be? You know, it's up to you. It's up to your party.
Of course it is. I'm not going to, and it does. It does require that partnership, and I'm not blaming Westminster in terms of this. One of the key things, I think, for example, talked about the gap, and I'll come back on that specific point on targets. For example, on the issue of guarantees. Wouldn't cost the government anything, and I'm not blaming it, but it wouldn't cost the UK government anything. To give us additional borrowing powers wouldn't cost the UK government anything. So it's not asking.
But the Scottish Government does have borrowing powers and has chosen to borrow in other areas.
Very limited.
But they have chosen to use them in other areas.
The limited power we have is £350 million.
And they've chosen to use them in other areas.
Yeah. But and have. But of course, there's also capital needs, for example, around about, you know, investment into NHS facilities. And I get that, and I get that discussion, and I get that argument in terms of that. I think coming back. In terms of where we are, it comes back to the systemic change we need to look at. I'm proud of the record that Scotland's got. It delivers 40% more head of population. In England, 70% more males. Is that enough? No, of course it's not. We need to be delivering more, and you just have to look at the some of the house prices and some of the areas that they demand. I'm talking about East Lothian and Edinburgh and Glasgow and so on. And where it's supply and demand. Of course, it's supply and demand, and it comes back to the discussion. And Jane obviously done the piece of work with it. He's talking about the actual needs that are there. And Scottish Government's doing a wee piece of work, so we need to understand what's there as well. It can't just be one size fits all. How do we deliver that? Because that 110,000 target, 10% is in rural Scotland. So that's 11,000 we deliver in, and that's feeding into the whole depopulation kind of argument in terms of that. So there are the barriers. You know, the construction costs have been difficult. You know, it's 20%, roughly 15 to 20% rise last year. Now, obviously, we give local authorities a benchmark in terms of what it had cost of an actual unit comes up. Now, some of the units in Edinburgh, for example, you're talking about £300,000 a unit for one house, £300,000. And you're talking about
in
rural areas, you're talking 20% even higher than that. So we announced the Rural Housing Action Plan pretty shortly since we came in that. So it's talking rural areas, it's talking about construction, it's talking about getting investment into the sector in terms of that. So I think there's a whole combination of things that have impacted. I said last year the completions was the highest we ever had since 2000. In terms of that, the real issues and the real concerns just now is obviously about the approvals and starts, which has dropped considerably. Now, some of it's controlled by that macroeconomic situation, some of it's more on what we need to do, and that's that systemic change that I'm talking about. I'm never going to shy away that we need to be building more houses. I've said that all along. In terms of that, how do I free up the system? How do I free up the system, and how do we make it, in particular in the big finance, and how do we free it up? And that's just where the discussions with RSLs, with housing local authorities, with investors, how do we free that up? And the Housing Investment Task Force, I think, gives us a real opportunity to then go ahead and say, right, where are the barriers? And it's driven by the sector. It's just not the Scottish Government, it's driven by the sector in terms of this is what we need to do. I then need to take that away and make sure that these actions are embedded, and it systemically changes what we're trying to do.
You hinted at it in your speech, and I'm interested in the language you used when the First Minister and the Finance Secretary told you what your budget was for this year. I don't know if you can repeat it, but you know, the budget's been cut significantly by around 200 million, or 26% or thereabouts. The capital element of the budget, which mainly funds grants for councils and housing associations to build new homes, has been cut by 75 million, 14% in real terms. Loan funding is down by £121 million, or 72% in real terms. and the cost of, as you just touched on there, of building new homes has increased. So the 3.5 billion that exists will buy less than it would have. I mean, you mustn't feel like a valued part of the government, given that they've basically told you to do one as they were making their budget decisions. And I'm sure the people here don't feel particularly treasured as part of the housing community. What did you say?
I think there are a couple of things. I think one, when the autumn statement came out, I think it was clear there was that travel direction. So that wasn't unexpected in terms of that, and we just had the budget last week in terms of that. There was, and this is not a portion of blame, there was a 10% cut in capital spending that we had. So that really should. Now, as part of that, you kind of touched on it. One, the costs that we had have obviously gone up. So the budget we set aside is obviously costing us a lot more. There was also contractual obligations in terms of that, and you've seen some issues around about NHS capital investment projects as well. So the capital projects fund cost has gone up quite considerably, 15-20%. The contractual obligations, I've looked at that as well, and I think that's important to mention. The other key thing, and I touched on it in the speech as well, was the financial transactions. Now, if you mention financial transactions to a lot of people in terms of that, not a lot of people in the housing sector, out with the housing sector, understand what it is. But that 62% cut has meant a real impact on what we can do with some of the borrowing or some of the help we can give to organisations in terms to make some of these projects work. We can give them loans at a much lower rate than they would get from Public Works Loan Board or institutional funding or anybody in terms of just going to the bank. So that's kind of been touched. So that's had a real impact. The financial transactions cut has had a real impact. And I talked about Ukraine. There was a 75% cut in 1 year on our funding for Ukraine. So obviously that puts more pressure in terms of that. So was I happy about the budget cut? There was issues obviously around about the impact it had on government. As I said, the work we were carrying about institutional investment has been ongoing for a period of months, as you said. We've been doing these things. So it's a challenge. It's an absolute challenge in terms of where we do. It makes the work, and I talked about accelerating the work we do in the investment sector, much more important. But this has been going on for months, even before the budget was even discussed, or the autumn statement was even discussed.
So there's been some criticism of the government's target and largely total failure to achieve its target. And I think you're reconsidering your target as we speak. One aspect of that, though, is the target to decarbonise 1 million homes by 2030. I'm not entirely clear how that's going to be achieved. What's happening with zero emission heating systems in new builds? It's obviously a lot easier to achieve what on earth we're going to do in older housing stock. It just feels like a massive and complicated and expensive and possibly a problem with union-based solutions, which you won't want to talk about. But if we're going to fund this stuff, we're going to have to find resources to do it, and I wouldn't want to be in your job trying to do that. So where are you on that?
I think there are a couple of things. I was on the local government committee until I obviously became minister. One of the things we had at that time was an inquiry into retrofitting, and we had evidence from Ken Gibb, who many people will know in terms of that, and Glasgow University had done a piece of work, estimated costs around about £33 billion over a period of time, but it would bring 15 to 20,000 jobs. Now that £33 billion is more likely £40 billion in terms of where construction's kind of going. So I think one, there was always discussion, and I've discussed this with UK government colleagues and Welsh government colleagues, that's going to require institutional investment. And when we were down speaking to investors in October, one of the key things we talked about was going down and speaking to them around about, and they were keen to talk a little bit about investment into that sector. Into that. Now there's a Green Heat Finance Task Force, which involves a number of people from the sector and London School of Economics and so on. Around about, there's a report due in about April time to talk about solutions for local authorities and talk about solutions for RSLs as well. So that will give a bit of context.
What are you expecting from that?
Again, this is the experts that can do that. I've seen some models in terms of how that works. So obviously, it's looking at the model over the whole lifetime cost, if you like, of that, and now and you get that rate of return. So I've seen some models. I'm not an expert in that field, but there are models that I've seen. So that will give that I think that some certainty, because I think if you're talking about RSLs and local authorities, and in terms of institutional investors, how does that stack into their wider investment outlook? Because if you're talking about an RSL or local authority, what's the upkeep of their existing stock? What's their investment model for building new housing, and how did they look at retrofit? So we need that policy clarity around about all these issues. So right across, there's no government in the world that will be able to afford this in terms of its own budget. The Scottish Government gave £1.8 million to look at some of the projects that could be developed. It will require institutional investment, and again we've been working closely with the UK government and the Welsh government in terms of what that kind of looks like. So there are models out there. The other key thing in terms of that is each local authority has their LE strategy, heat and energy efficiency strategy. So there was a strategy to be delivered for each local authority, because the solution in Edinburgh will be different as in East Lothian as it is in Glasgow and in rural. So there was strategies that have been brought forward which the Scottish Government are looking at the moment. There needs to be a deliverability plan at the end of the year. So that's talking about what each local authority needs to do that now. My own local authority, for example, looking at district heating networks. So I had a conference with them and the council talking around about what can we do around about that. So one's about the financing, two's around about the policy clarity in terms of that, and three is around about what are the local solutions for local areas. We need to do it. We absolutely need to do it.
I did notice that the Competition and Markets Authority has suggested new powers, enforcement powers given to local planning authorities by the Scottish Government to push through the building of new homes. Do you like that?
I'd spoken to CMA probably about 3 months ago, and they knew the report was coming. So I've got a meeting coming up with the CMA to talk around about that and what the report's in.
Surely empowering local government to...
Of course. I mean, I come from a local government authority now. The CMA obviously they've done this across the UK. So there's obviously summaries for England, Wales, and Scotland. So we're obviously focusing on the general outcome of that, but obviously what are they saying for Scotland. So I'll be sit down with the CMA to talk around about that and what we can do. But we kind of discussed that briefly when I met with them previously. But we'll be sitting down with them and discussing some of the things that they've mentioned, because it talks about planning. It obviously talks about the important thing, and Jane and I had a number of round tables with planning officials, head of planning, to talk around about how do we get planning moving as well. So that obviously feeds into the process that's there. But yeah, we'll be sitting down with CMA and discussing what the recommendations that they've got.
Okay, I've got two more questions then I'd like to come to the audience. I can't let the conversation go without reference to shelter. And Alison Watson, the director of Shelter, has described Shelter Scotland has described a housing emergency with homeless at an all-time high. Shelter says there are nearly 10,000 children currently homeless, living in temporary accommodation. There are now 15,000, nearly 16,000 households in temporary accommodation, around 132,000 households waiting for social housing. In total, nearly 31,000 people are deemed homeless and not in permanent accommodation. And she says that councils are now breaching legal obligations to provide for homeless families on an industrial scale. It's getting ever more desperate, she says. We deliberately describe what's happening as a housing emergency. That's not empty words. What we're seeing is exceptional. The government says it's doing great things, but these are the facts and figures. That's why I call it gaslighting. That's one of the most damning statements I've ever seen about a government. I mean, genuinely just kind of staggering, and whether the language is emotional or not, it should be emotional because we're talking about kids and families not being able to get a roof over their heads of any quality. How do you feel about that?
I have a good relationship with Alison.
I'm not asking about your relationship with Alison.
No,
How do you feel about the stuff she said?
I'll talk. I've got a good relationship with Alison. I bumped into her last week at the CIH conference and we discussed this. So we discussed that in terms of that. In terms of gaslighting, absolutely no. And I'll come to some of the things that's been looked at. In declaring a housing emergency, that doesn't bring any additional powers to myself. It doesn't bring anything to the UK government. I think one of the key things is talking about actions. So last week, for example, we sat down with Edinburgh and I sat down with the housing community and the head of housing talked around about how can we work closer together. That's the real key part around about that, and I'll touch on some of the actions, is how can we talk about it, because the housing situation in Edinburgh and Glasgow are probably quite unique in terms of where they are compared with other parts of Scotland. The real pressures are in Edinburgh and Glasgow and Fife. So I think last July we talked around about key things in tackling that. One was about acquisitions. And there was a fund set aside for that. Now that's been picked up and that's been, particularly in Edinburgh and Glasgow, what they do in terms of that. Allocations, I think it's incredibly important. How can we look at how, when we're allocating houses to homelessness. Now there's work we need to do, for example, in Glasgow about that, getting that figured up. There's Stock Transfer Authority. So we need to work with the RSLs about getting allocations up from currently 45-50% up to about 70%, which was the target. I think that's one of the key things. The Housing Strategy Board talked around about that as well. So acquisitions is incredibly important part of that. So how can we look talking about acquisitions? How can we then talk around about some of the issues in terms about allocations? I think that's important. And part, obviously, the long-term sustainable funding of part is really important as well. So we are doing work with that. So we sit down with Glasgow and Edinburgh and Fife, particularly in terms of what the specific actions we need. The empty homes issue, Edinburgh has an empty homes, and they acknowledge this. Edinburgh has 1,500 empty homes at the moment. Now they've got roughly 5,000 people in there, so that's a third of the target. And I'll have to give Derek McGowan his praise. Derek came down from Aberdeen, and Joanna's sitting there, and I have to say that Derek came down from Aberdeen, coming to Edinburgh, and he's doing a fantastic job, an absolute fantastic job. he's picking up a challenging situation, but we need to work with him on that. So how do you reduce the empty homes? How do we turn around the empty homes? How do we turn around the voids? I think it's really important. I've asked for figures in terms of the voids. I don't think the voids figures we'll have in Scotland will be far off around about the number of people in temporary accommodation. So how do we focus on that? So there'll be a piece of work in terms of how do we turn around the voids. Part of the issue that Edinburgh has in voids is it can't get enough qualified work people to turn it around. So how do we work them in terms of that? So there are challenges in terms of that. So these are the short-term things.
But you're going to turn this round?
Yeah, I'm going to turn it around. And I think
by when?
Well, we said we reduce it by 2026. I think one of the key things, and I touched on it before, around about the homeless monitor. This is crisis, but it's the What University that do the piece of work around about that. If you look at that report, there are the two key things they talked about. It's poverty driven. The two key things they talked about, the first two key measures was one was increasing local housing allowance to the rate of where it should be, and the second thing was talking about universal credit rates, welfare rates. In terms of that, they've seen the two measures would reduce homelessness quite substantially in Scotland. That's not me, that's crisis, and that's the homeless network. That's What University telling us that. So these are some of the asks I talked around about what we need for the UK government. And I'm not blaming the UK government. I need to be building more houses. We need to make sure there's more temporary accommodation units that are there as well to support that. We need to make sure there's supported accommodation, and you and I have talked about that before, and about the supported accommodation, that we need to support people once they're into homelessness. They don't go back in and they're ingrained in that system. So there's work we need to do that. So we're doing work around about supported accommodation, for example. So, and again, the work on supported accommodation, there is a role for social investment, and there are social investors already doing that. How can we maximise that around about that as well? So it's incredibly challenging in terms of where we are. It is a perfect storm. There are far too many people in homelessness, particularly about the kids that you talked about. But we are working really closely local authorities about how we can specifically help them. And I said, when I met with Derek last week, we were talking about how can we support them in terms of the empty homes, for example, and particularly the voids. If we can turn around the voids, and I think Derek had said they'd hope to reduce it by 1,000 in the next year, that would make a huge difference. We need to be building more units, we need to get more funds in terms of that into local authorities. The other thing, obviously, that we brought through the housing bill is the prevention duties. So how do we prevent people going homelessness in the first place? We need to fully fund that. And detail will come through when the housing bills kind of go forward. How do we fund the prevention duties? And that's incredibly important. People don't arrive in, most people arrive in the homeless situation and it's a shock to them. It's not something that's coming, it's maybe an event or whatever. And more, I also have responsibility for debt and welfare. More and more the situation that we're seeing, before in terms of CABs, it was people getting into credit issues. Now we've got real situations where people's expenditure is more than income. Full stop. Full stop. And that becomes extremely difficult in terms of that. Can't afford to pay the rent, can't afford to pay the mortgage. So that's a real issue around about that as well. So there are issues that we need to work with in incoming government and around about universal credit and local housing allowance. And that's not just, but we need to be doing more in terms of looking at the temporary accommodation. There was a short-term group set up to look at about obviously the use of temporary accommodation and trying to get that units in. But it comes back to allocations, acquisitions.
I don't think anyone doubts how complex it is, but you're the man in the seat, so you're the man to be asked. My last question is about a real bugbear of mine, which is rent controls, which I think is probably the most disproven policy in economic history, and one that's been chosen by the Scottish Government, driven by the Scottish Greens, who are responsible for most of the bad ideas in the Scottish Government. So one report I've seen...
Few people coughing in the audience.
Well, I actually suspect you're coughing as well, Paul, because I doubt very much that you think rent controls are a solution or a sensible idea. One report I've seen found there's 3.2 billion stalled investment by pension funds wanting to build for rent in Scotland. This is in part due to lack of confidence in policy direction and rent control. Edinburgh and Glasgow below 70th position in the UK for new rental housing. And rent controls might work for people who are in rental accommodation already. People who want to get into rental accommodation are suddenly finding that rental accommodation is drying up. I don't get it. And you talked earlier in your speech about long-term rent controls. Mm-hmm. This is like an innovation beyond innovation. Scottish Government is reinventing economic theory as we go, and not in a good way. Can you justify this to me, please?
In terms of rent controls, obviously there's a piece of analysis that's been carried out. There's always that temporary measure that kind of came in as part of that. Legally, it can't go on for...
Do you agree with rent controls?
Well, I'll explain where I'm coming from in that one. So I when the policy was brought in, it was to look at the issue around about affordability, and there was a real issue around about affordability, because we did see it, and in most of the sector, and I'll put that, most of the sector,
build more houses.
Yeah, of course it is. That's part of the solution. Most of the developers, overwhelmingly, in terms of rent control, were people responsible, but there was a small number who weren't, and people were getting impacted by rent increases that were far in excess of what people could afford. The short-term measures were kind of brought in. There was always that discussion around about longer term what needs to be done, and certainly when we spoke to investors, one of the key things I asked was around about and the rent issue. They're not against, and Retty's even mentioned that themselves. The report I think that I think John had put together, talking around about the response to that. One was they prefer not to have them. Second thing, if they do though, there were certain recommendations that kind of came forward. When we spoke to investors, they're not against rent controls per se. There are good models and there are bad models. We talked around about Denmark and Sweden and how they both got rent controls, but what's the level of detail behind that?
A very different housing market.
Well, if you look at some of the market, they're not. You look at, and again, this is part of the longer term rent controls have been an issue in terms of where that market kind of goes, and I think that was important. And we got a specific piece of work around about how Denmark had done it, how Sweden had done it, and how that had different outcomes in terms of that. So very, and quite similar housing markets in terms of this. The key thing, as I said, is making sure we get the balance of protect the most vulnerable in society in terms of that, but in longer term rent controls, but not stopping investment coming into the sector.
So what about the people who don't have rented accommodation that try to get in there and find that the supply is drying up?
Well, I think one of the key things obviously is with this isn't just institutional investors in terms of that certainty. It needs to become to the PRS sector as well. So I mean, Scottish Association of Landlords talking about this a couple of weeks ago. So again, it's talking around about that and what that needs to do to make sure we get, I suppose, that level of confidence into that sector. There's a piece of work we need to do. I need to build up on the confidence and acknowledge that to John when we had that chat. And I think that's important. And it comes back to the whole tenure approach. Because we need the PRS sector, that's incredibly important. We need obviously the residential market. We need to be building more social housing. So it's an all tenure approach. The longer term rent controls hopefully would give us that clarity to investors and obviously provide still respect provide that level of comfort to people who are struggling to pay their rent at this stage.
I'm interested just to ask the audience, because you people know much more about housing than I do. How many of you are in favour of the government's current rent control policy? Could you put your hand up? If you're not in favour, could you put your hand up? Some of you just don't know. Okay, that's fine. What about long-term rent controls? Anyone in favour of that? Hands up. 2 people, 3 people. You know what? Absolutely fine. There's a good debate to be had there, and thank you for asking that, for answering that question. Now I'd like to take some questions. So if you'd like to ask, could you put your hand up, please? And I'm quite short-sighted, so I've said this before at these events, but if I say the lady in the purple and you answer I'm the Bishop of Durham, it's my mistake. There, please, sir, just in the middle there.
Yeah, thanks very much. Stuart Argo from the Big Partnership. We're a PR marketing agency, and we have a lot of clients in multiple sectors: property, construction, housing, transport, who say we've got money to invest, we want to invest it, and the things that we want to invest in are aligned with the Scottish Government's priorities, but they bump up against the Scottish Government that, rather than enabling that investment, especially considering the government has no money, actually stands in the way of that. And I want to get your reaction to one specific example, which is actually about transport, but it is also to do with housing. And it's in the public domain, which is why I'm happy talking about it. There's Winchborough, Newtown in West Lothian, thousands of new homes, mixed homes. The developer there has paid for a new motorway junction. It's paid for a marina along the canal. It has been trying for years to get agreement from the powers that be to build a train station, which you would think is a pretty good idea, especially thinking about people commuting to the west of Edinburgh. I won't bore you or everyone else with the details around that, but the government, faced with the offer of significant investment from a private housing and Newtown developer, will not take yes for an answer. And the thing I'm asking about is, what can the government do to get out of the way of people who are prepared to back effectively Scottish Government ambitions with their own money, rather than the government getting in the way of that?
I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I'm aware of the Winchborough project in detail. and I'm not going to talk about the project. I could talk about the project in detail with you, and I'm happy to take that offline. There are other things that are involved in that discussion. I've offered to meet Winchburg and talk about that. One of the key things we talked about the city region discussions. Winchburg is one of the key strategic sites. What do we need to deliver that? So I think that's one of the key things. I think when you're talking about investment into Scotland, now if we're talking about specifically housing, then I spoke to investors in terms of that, and you mentioned about the figures that's there, that it's ready to invest in Scotland, but needs that policy clarity. I think if you're talking about inward investment into Scotland, and this is from noticed in terms of UK, Scotland always sits second, just behind London. Always, for years it has sat there. So there is an inward investment coming in, and the figures are not my figures. There's an inward investment coming into Scotland. So that's in terms of that. So that people are keen to invest in Scotland. We already seen, for example, around about the Freeport, and I was up in the Freeport up in Inverness, where we talked around about the opportunities for housing and obviously economic development. There was £300 million just invested by a Japanese company, talking about that. There are numerous discussions going on with other investors around about that. So one about in terms of that, so how do we bring that in? So inward investment will continue to flow into Scotland because it's a good place to invest. In terms of the coming back to the housing model, I think it's really important that we have that, talking about the rent controls and other issues in terms of that. And this is where it kind of comes back to the work of the Housing Investment Task Force, is what are the barriers and how do we break down these barriers. But people are investing in Scotland and at a high level, consistently at a high level, for a number of years, and inward investment figures show that. These are my figures, these are ONS, and it kind of comes through that. So there is that. I want to get people investing into housing, not just in BTR, not just in MMR, but in social housing investment in terms of that. As I said, with the Winchburg project, the City Region deal, discussions mentioned Winchburg. How do we make that happen? So, of course, we want to break down barriers in terms of that. But Scotland consistently has performed really strongly in terms of investment for a long number of years.
Okay. Yes, sir.
David Beaufort, a long time ago, Director of Housing at the Scottish Government, and also involved in homelessness. Paul, clearly your job is to put the best possible gloss on a hopelessly unacceptable situation.
You obviously understand politicians.
Respect for that. But I mean, the red lights are flashing.
Of course they are.
Flashing, aren't they?
Yeah.
You've got 3 councils at least. You've got Edinburgh, Glasgow, and curiously Argyll and Boots saying that they have a housing emergency. They're effectively saying to you, we're in a desperate situation. And then you've got 10,000, Chris mentioned this, 10,000 children living in temporary accommodation. 130% up on 2014. 130% up. And then you've got the Scottish Housing Regulator saying there is systemic failure and the councils cannot live up to their statutory obligations. And then you've got that shelter response to your budget, which is written in the most, well, they say the government has priced in homelessness in its a rise in homelessness in its budget decisions. Now, 200 million reduction in the housing budget, that is inevitably going to mean less houses for social housing. Shelter, if they were there, would make the point that the Scottish Government, I've no doubt you tried your best to get as much investment in housing as possible, but Shelter would make the point that you've lost out to policing, to prisons, even to the Scottish National Bank, all of which have an increased budget, and housing has gone down. So I don't see how you can really argue that housing has gone up the agenda. I just want to draw you up, but we could have a long discussion about this, but this is a think tank, and we need really to have some reflective discussions. How, and your party is not alone, how can we raise housing up, and particularly social housing, up the political agenda? How can we ensure that it has higher priority than it has? Because surely decent housing is a fundamental human right, and we're failing to deliver that. And I suspect you're always going to lose out in your discussions with your colleagues to people from health and even justice, who will say, well, we need this investment and therefore housing must take a cut. Now, how are you actually going to do that? I mean, we have a lot of strategies, a lot of action plans, but actually delivering them from your perspective is going to be extremely difficult. And I'd like a better feel feel from, a realistic feel from, where we should get on the social housing scene in 10 years' time? Where should we be then? Shall we be in a situation where homelessness applications are going up even higher than they are now? Can we really expect any significant improvement in the direction of your objective, which you gave some years ago, of eradicating homelessness? And really that is not an objective for 2040. That's an objective for 2070 or 2080 at best.
I almost feel like I should give you a standing ovation for that. That's an extraordinary
I think there was
contribution.
a number of
Good luck.
number of points he raised. One about the housing agenda. And Chris and Ali will know about this. One of the key things, we catch up now and again. One of the key things I said to him, look, I'd be keen to do something on housing. In terms of that, and I talked to him about one of the key things is trying to get housing further up the political agenda, and I think that's important. When I went down and spoke to investors, I knew that wouldn't be the easiest discussion, but I wanted to do it. And part of the reason tonight, and I said to you right at the start, is open and frank discussion. We need to get housing up the political agenda, not just in Scotland, in the UK, more generally. And in terms of that, I think that's incredibly important. And I hope it does go up the political agenda, not just because we're in the situation we're in, but because it's much more important. It's not just about housing. It's not just, of course, the most important part is the roof over people's head. It's the economic impact it has in terms of that, but it's also the longer term health issues it has in terms of that. It's the longer term mental health issues it has in that. And one of the key things I've done when coming into post about homelessness is we set up a ministerial oversight group on homelessness. It includes 10 ministers. So it's not, I can't just, because you're talking about public health, you're talking around about the promise, you're talking about obviously in terms of the National Care Service. So there's lots of inputs into that one. I think one of the key things is obviously listening to the sector. I mentioned about the homelessness monitor report, and I think that's really important. Met the crisis and talked about that. There was an event in the Parliament we talked about. So that's working with governments in terms of universal credit, for example, and talking about local housing allowance. I think that's incredibly important. So it's a partnership. I've had real difficulties now in the last 4 years in terms of the UK government. There have been 16 housing ministers. In the time I've been in a year, there have been 5. So trying to get discussions with that has been difficult in terms of that, but it needs a partnership approach with UK government. And there'll be a series of asks that I'll be taking to UK government in terms of that. It's working with local authorities and how can we work with local authorities. And then today, part of the discussions about the local authorities was talking about how can we get more finance into the sector. So they welcomed that approach. We had RSLs yesterday. They welcomed that approach. We need to develop these models with SNIB, SFT, HubCo, and so on to try and look at in terms of that. We need to be building more houses. That's because if we build more houses, there's the reduction in homelessness. If we build more houses, it obviously encourages more economic development. We need to be building more houses. The deliverability review that I mentioned will involve the sector. Then the Housing Investment Task Force will involve the sector. I can't do it on my own, and that's not diminishing responsibility in terms of that. I will always be accountable for this, always, and I'm never going to shy away from that in terms of that. But we need that partnership approach, and I think that's really important. So I need to make sure we get more money into the sector, which we've been working on for a period of months. We need to make sure that we're tackling homelessness in terms of that. We talked about allocations and so on. It is the most challenging time probably for housing in the last, certainly in devolution times, probably for the last 50, 60, 70 years. We've seen in terms of, I suppose, living standards have gone, they're now going back. They're now going back the way, not my figures, they're now going back the way we're probably, in terms of living standards, the worst off we've been for 50 years. Now, there's been lots of situations around about Ukraine and the cost of living crisis, which haven't helped that. So it's a really challenging situation. It's about getting more money into the sector. It's about tackling in the short-term issues around about homelessness. So one of that is LHA, one of the universal credits. But what can we do about allocations? What can we do about empty homes? What can we do about voids to make sure that we're turning around these things as quickly as we possibly can? So it's challenging. It's extremely challenging. It's complex, but we need to get all these areas right in terms of how we deliver that. So am I going to shy away from that? Absolutely not. I'll always be. I'm the housing minister. I'm accountable for where we are just now. There are decades in terms of the system. There are things for decades we should have been changing a long time ago in the UK and Scotland. This is about the systemic change that I'm talking about, and what was really interesting, and there was a few people that were at the CIH conference, and many of you all know Duncan McLennan, and I talked about him as well. Duncan came up and said the exact same thing. It's about system change in terms of that, and it is about system change. But I'm not the expert in this. I know a fair bit about housing. You guys are the experts. I need to listen to what's coming in, and when we're talking about the homelessness discussion, so we're talking around about the Housing Investment Task Force and the deliverability review. It's driven by the sector, and that's a conscious decision. It's not government, it's driven by the sector, and that's something I'm really keen to keep on, and I touched that in the speech. So.
Okay, we've got time for another couple of questions. Willie, if you...
Willie Hockey, on the City Group. Minister Paul, Chris, thanks for creating a platform for us to have a view. Paul, in the time I've met you in the chats I've had, you seem like a very honest guy, and I believe that you would really like to make a difference. I think the first place you have to start is some of the numbers you've been quoting tonight that you've been given, I can tell you're absolutely not true. So that's 70% ahead of Wales and 40%. Years ago when we were not meeting the targets for, and this is not a political statement, years ago when we were not meeting the targets for meeting houses, they changed the wording for new build or refurb. And I can tell you there's thousands of things in there that cost 2,000 and 3,000 that are propping up all these numbers. If we've got somebody to do a bit of work and actually the amount of houses, so I think we have to start being honest about actually how many we're building. But the main point, I'm not actually going to ask the question I came to ask tonight, I'm actually going to answer the question that you made the point about barriers. Unfortunately, Paul, when you're talking to investors down in England, they're going to be nice to you and they're going to tell you that yes, we will invest in Scotland, because they don't want you reading in the paper tomorrow that somebody's leaked it out, that Aviva or LNG will not. I can tell you, and I'm sure Matthew will tell you, that that is absolutely not what's happening on the ground. I'm someone who's gone down there with loads of my own money, millions of pounds, hundreds of millions of pounds, trying to borrow. And I can tell you how I've been told to word applications, right? Don't put in Scotland, put in England, even though you might build them all in Scotland. And the main reason why I came here today, we've seen in the budget last week in the UK, the good thing about budgets now, or about new builds, there's no surprises, everything gets leaked out. There was not one thing in the UK budget last week that we didn't know about, and I'll guarantee that all the things that have been leaked out about the new housing bill is all going to be part of it. And I can say to you here, I can save your task force a lot of time. Seriously, you don't need to put them together. If what is being leaked is a reflection of what the new bill is going to look like, I can tell you right now, the housing crisis in Scotland will be 5 times worse. Yeah. 5 times worse. I will guarantee you that, and because I'll be one of them, right? I will be packing up my tent, right? Ready to build 11,000 houses over the next 10 years. If some of the things I'm seeing and hearing about the new bill, about now, talk about rent freeze. Thank you for coming to see the development you're doing. Patrick Harvard's trying to get a bill through the Scottish Government where he wants to cap people's rent at 3%. I've invited him 10 times to come and look at our development. Well, we're going to write into the lease, right, that your rent cannot go up by more than 2%. And he's trying to introduce a bill. Right. So I'm all for trying to make it a good deal for people in the start, but the main thing that worries me about the bill more than anything is that we are getting confused with our requirement for houses and our rush to meet the climate change specification. And if we don't get this sorted out, we're not going to solve any of the two of them. But we should take these two major negatives and actually make them into a positive. And it's the only way. I was talking about you earlier to someone who's in the audience that if we've now got our biggest utility providers saying like SSE and Seagreen saying now we can produce enough clean energy for 1.6 million houses in Scotland, we're only 1.3 million short. If we work with them to do that, then all the energy supplied to every house in Scotland, if we could tell that to the world, I'm telling you, you'll get money coming in here, right? But what we won't do is, we won't get anybody building any houses if we're telling them that you have to fit this type of stuff to get an ECP, that you've got to fit a heat pump, you need to fit solar panels, you need to nobody wants to get to a green, to a carbon zero house faster than me. We're telling people things at the moment that are not true, right? And I would love, my main question tonight is, see before the government come and tell us about fitting heat pumps or about building CHPs, seating districts, go and ask any of their local authorities right now who have already built a CHP. Go and ask Clydebank how successful their district heating system has been and how much of a financial failure it's been. So for me, I would just like the government, before they tell me what the rules are, that we've proved it scientifically. Not that somebody's been to Finland and seen a wee house. Patrick Harvey's never been to Finland. Right, but I think, and I know that you will find that your hands are tied. In the past 10 days, Paul, with everything that's going on in the world, the front page headline in most of the national papers has been about the housing crisis. right? If we don't wake up and smell the coffee and really get our act together here, we're going to be right in trouble. And please stop blaming Maggie Thatcher for selling off all the houses in the 80s. The point I make to everybody, and talk about Labour people who do this as well, people still live in these houses. But that isn't part of the problem. The part of the problem is we have not built enough houses. Can I leave you one last thing? If you want to be famous, Paul, before you leave this job, whether it's in 2 years or 5 years, let us please drop the word social for housing. There's a stigma to it, there's a tag to it. I lived in a social house for the first 20 years of my life. Let's just make them different degrees of affordability.
Couple of things. I lived in a council property for 30 years, well 25 years with parents, so I come from that background. In terms of the house bill, you know, I can't go into that detail in terms of that. The other key thing, you mentioned about the energy kind of stuff. I used to chair the cross-party group in renewables in the Parliament, so work very closely with the renewable sector. The biggest wind farm is coming on shore in my area, if it gets consent, which is Berwick Bank, so working really closely with them, working closely with SSE and spending around about the value of housing and how much, what they need to do to deliver that. So again, working very closely. I touched around about the in terms of the heating solutions of local LE strategies. That's up to each local authorities in terms of what they need to do in terms of that. I mentioned around about district heating systems in East, for example, it's been looked at in East Lothian. There is institutional investment talking to the council now and in other parts of Scotland. So I know that's going on right now because they've told me that, local authorities have told me that. So that's going on at that level of discussion. When I went down and spoke to investors, I can assure you they weren't all telling me just, oh yes, we'll invest in Scotland. It was the opposite in terms of that. So they were frank in terms of the discussions. I still have frank discussions in terms of that. So they've not shied away from telling me that. I'm not going to ask people to shy away from that either. In terms of that. So the key thing is coming back to how we need to be building more houses. The 70% and 40% is true in terms of that. Now we can look into the level of details around about where RSLs and local authorities in terms of that. That's a factual figure that's out there. Is it enough? No, absolutely not enough. And I'm not going to shy away from that either. So we have real challenges, but these have been challenges that have been there for decades, I would say. Now, and I'm talking about, it's not thinking about the edges, it's about systemic change that we're looking to do in terms of that. So I can't change historically what's going on for decades in terms of where we're right now isn't just over the last 2 or 3 years. It's not been helped by some of the macroeconomic positions, obviously in Ukraine, and the asylum dispersal as well has created problems, and Glasgow referenced that themselves in terms of that. So historically, can we change that? No. What do we need to do? And this comes back to Housing Investment Task Forces. What can we need to do? And it's not just investment, as I said, into MMR to BTR. It's investment in social housing. So there have been discussions with people who are willing to invest in social housing in terms of that right now, in terms of that, and these are continued to develop. So that, you know, we need to get the rent control part of it right. We need to make sure it's what are the other barriers out there. I either make the choice that if it's a Housing Investment Task Force, we need to get people from the sector, not government, from the sector telling us what we need to do. And I think before we've kind of had it's kind of been that bit meal approach, but it's people coming forward with specific applications for specific funding. We need to look at it on a Scotland-wide basis in terms of how we deliver that. Is it a challenge? Of course it's a challenge. It's absolutely a challenge. And you know, if you go to any housing minister just now, they'll tell you the exact same thing. But it's England, Wales, but that aside, we need to be building more houses. And I'm not going to shy away from that. Absolutely, we need to be building more houses. We do need that partnership approach. We do need support. As I said, it comes back to the key thing. If every other housing minister in Europe has the ability to borrow money, it has the ability to do that. I don't have the ability to do that. If I could go out and borrow money to build more housing, and this is not a political point, this is a financial business case point, because if we had that, housing pays for itself. So one of the key asks I'll be taking to any other government will be around about they give us the power to borrow more monies, because we'd be building more houses. It's as simple as that. And this is a business point. This isn't talking about housing or borrowing powers for everything else. This is talking about specific housing. The one key thing you've got with housing is it's got an income stream that's coming in. Yeah. So if I had that ability to borrow, we would be in a much better situation. That will be a key ask, whether it's a Conservative government or Labour government coming in, that is a key ask. I've already said that to Miles Briggs, I've already said that to Mark as well in terms of that. We need this. Please take that back to your governments down in Westminster, prospective governments, and tell us if that's one of the key things. So there's an ask around about that.
Paul, here's where you have got the ability. Stop bad bills.
Yeah, well, one of the key things that's talked about, for example, in the Housing 2040 Strategy Board, and we talked about that is the bills and reviewing the bills that are there. Yeah. In terms of that. So yeah, there are different, it's complex. You can touch on some of the challenges that are there.
Right, let me just move on now. Willie gets to ask a long question. Nobody else does. Woman in the kind of green yellow top. I'm not very good with green. No, it's you. You're looking behind you. It's you. Sorry, mustard. My wife would kill me.
I would have probably said green as well.
But thank you.
Hang on, I'm going to take a couple just because we're running out of time.
I know, and I'm going to try to.
Women at the back as well. So we'll take the two of you. So if you want to go first, lady in mustard. Women in mustard.
Well, it's better than lady in red, isn't it? So, first of all, thank you very much for taking the question, and hello. Minister, I'm pleased to hear about the task force, and there are two things that come out from what you've been saying tonight. Systemic change and institutional investment, and it's not a question, but it is a point. I'm wondering how we can do that with those key players. I'm interested in the who's on the task force and their thinking, because I think there's one thing, there's probably 100 things that we haven't thought about tonight, but one of them is, with the emphasis on institutional investment, I think we have a tendency to think, oh, it's only the people with lots of money, it's only the people with lots of borrowing powers that can sort this. I think we're overlooking this sort of civic part of solving homelessness in Scotland, and Tom Muir and myself, Helen Carlin, are from Common Ground. A couple of years ago we took in £700,000 worth of investment from individuals. So my ask is to have a chat about this and not take up more time with my mustard top, but to make that task force, because I am, after 25 years of working in homelessness, really quite knowledgeable but also cynical about the chance for change without starting to think out the box. And I would like to promote that idea, particularly in terms of an increasingly divided society, that there are people with money in the bank account that could be doing something useful to it. Obviously my attendance at the meetings will depend on the level of buffet and parfait, but if you are looking for someone, and if we're serious about change in Scotland, to actually represent very far end of the homelessness street population, who's actually done something about it, then even if it's sausage rolls, I'll be happy to attend and speak beyond the traditional institutional, we know it all investment.
As long as there's mustard.
No,
We're just going to take the other question
I'll
as well, if that's
course.
all right. Paul, yeah, back there. Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Ellie Wagstaff from Marie Curie, so we support people who are terminally ill. I think there's a lot of discussion when we're thinking about housing, about making homes fit to live in, but from my perspective it's really important that they're fit to die in as well, because we know that a lot of people are, more people are dying at home, so we know by 2040 2/3 of people are going to be dying in community settings, and that includes their own homes. And I know there's the housing standards poll that will apply to all new tenures to make sure that they're accessible, and just to get a sense from you how you're defining accessibility, and also how you'll prioritise vulnerable groups like people who are terminally ill in retrofitting existing tenures to make sure that they're fit for purpose, that people have the adaptations that they need in their homes to live and to die in.
Just on that point, Ellie, I'll take your point first. One of the most moving meetings I had was with the MND Scotland, and met with them, and there was a family who'd lost their dad, and he was over probably a 9-month period in terms of that. They tried to get adaptations from the local authority. By the time they'd got to that, the dad had passed away. So one of the key things we're talking about was, and I think we briefly discussed this, was establishing a pathway for people with debilitating diseases or terminal illness and so on, to make sure that the local authority is picking up. Now, Alacho picked it up along with COSLA, and are trying to develop that. So that's one piece of work around about that, not just MND, but other diseases in terms of that. So there'll be new guidelines that will be going out to local authorities in terms of that. We need to make sure that there's the funding for the adaptations as well. I think one of the key things in terms of that is making sure that's built into local housing strategies. At the moment, it kind of isn't. And I said, when MND talked to us, they were talking about, there are some local authorities that have got really good practices, there are some that don't. So it's trying to get that uniform approach in terms of that. Happy to pick that with you. But Alacho and COSLA are working on that specific point in terms of that. Coming back to the lady in mustard, was saying that I think the key thing there is, and I talked about the supported accommodation, and you and behind you from Cyrenians, they've been doing a wee piece of work as well. I've met the Simon community, we've met other organisations that have had social investment into that, so that's coming from investors also. And I think there's a real opportunity to grow that, and there's a number, I think there's about 4 or 5 projects in Edinburgh that have been doing similar type of things, so there's an opportunity to grow the social investment side of things. In terms of the approach, I think one of the key things, and this is not just in rural parts of Scotland, I mean there's lots of organisations trying to develop housing, you know, whether it's co-op housing for example, and there's been some work around about Port Students talking about co-op housing. Delivering that whole kind of model I think is really important, so I'd be happy to catch up with you and meet with you to discuss that in more detail. There is that role, that's incredibly important in that role, particularly one around about homelessness, because I think that's important, and it has come back to that supporting institutional investment, social investment for supported accommodation. The model works, how do we scale it up and make it work as well? And that does include individuals, for example, contribute to that, so more than happy to pick up, get your details of that, and happy to catch up with you and discuss in more detail.
We're going to finish, but I've got this pleading face there, so
I'll be very quick, because you've name checked SSEN quite a few times tonight, as have others. I'm Mary Jarvie, I'm the Housing Strategy Manager from SSEN, and I would just like to caution that these big developers like us who have got an interest in housing to accommodate thousands of workers for our energy investments over the next few years are not a silver bullet that are going to solve this issue. We aren't housing developers, but we can work in collaboration with RSLs and councils, and we're having some really wonderful, creative, productive conversations with them. But our ability to invest to make a difference in the housing prices and also to solve our own challenges to accommodate our workers, which this problem creates for us, relies on a robust and healthy housing sector, RSLs and councils, because and housing trusts and community organisations, because it's through those organisations and private developers as well that we'll be able to solve some of our problems. So yeah, absolutely, we're working hard on housing strategy, but I'm really keen to understand what the Scottish Government can do to enable those creative solutions that we can develop with our colleagues in councils and RSLs and elsewhere in the housing sector.
It's not silver bullet, as you said. Your name was mentioned actually in the meeting I had today with colleagues. I think I had a chat with a couple of your colleagues just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, you did.
They said they were coming into post in terms of that. I think there are a number of things. One is obviously there'll be the short-term requirement for accommodation. How can we work with yourself in terms of looking around about how can we turn that round and flip that round in terms of that to longer term housing? I think there's a piece of work we need to be doing, and what does that look like? I know you've been having individual discussions with local authorities, and they've all been complementary, I have to say, in terms of that. For me, it's getting that strategic overview. What does that kind of look like? I think there was one key example around about when I've done summer tour last year, going around about Inverness, for example, and there's a piece of work obviously going around about the Green Freeport up there. So one of the key things I took the action point was we got the council together, we got 12 housing developers who had never developed in that area together, housing developers and RSLs in terms of that. We talked about opportunities, about the jobs that it'll bring, so it's almost trying to identify what does that kind of look like. Where do the jobs go? Where do the people need to live? It's not just a case of just trying to plop it around about Inverness, where it is, it's how do we spread that around about that. So it's trying to get that strategic overview is one of the things. How can we partner with you in terms of what are your short-term accommodation needs, what's the longer-term opportunities for us then to flip that round. And on a smaller scale, the Commonwealth Games Village was an example. And in terms of that was used for short term, flipped it round, it's now housing, and it's not an easy thing. We need that strategic overview, but it's engaging with developers as we did with the Green Freeport opportunities up in Inverness, and making sure that people who hadn't invested before have got the opportunity to invest. It's about creating scale, about trying to get people involved in the sector, and that's really challenging when it comes to some of the remote areas that you're building in. So it's that strategic discussion, and I'm sure your colleagues would have said, what we're planning to do then before the summertime is pull together a round table with developers, with yourselves, with the Scottish Government to say strategically how can we take this issue forward. One, about the short-term accommodation, but two, how can we flip that round and give that longer-term housing solution for areas that need that, because we talked about the impact in Shetland and Orkney, the Western Isles. There are huge opportunities to try and turn around that, and this is not just about housing, this is about turning around the depopulation challenges up there and bringing economic development there. But we need to make sure it can't be done without housing, and economic development part kind of ties in. So it's the strategic partnership that will add real value, and then we can ensure and we get the developers coming in and speaking about that and developing these areas that they haven't worked in before. If we miss this opportunity, it becomes really difficult in the back of that. So strategic partnership, it adds real value, I think.
Well, listen, we are way over time, and I know there are people with questions, and maybe Paul, to be honest, afterwards, I'm going, but you can grab him. He is the most accessible of ministers, which is one of the many things to his credit, and I think his honesty tonight and willingness to listen to the points you've made and the questions you've asked and respond with some frankness is to your credit, Paul. I wouldn't have expected anything less. I'll just say that at Reform Scotland, we've done bits and pieces on housing in the past, I think, Ali, and we're keen to do more because it's an issue, as many of you have said, that should be higher up the agenda. We talk about education a lot, we talk about health, we talk about the economy. Housing fits into all of those things in one way or another, and we'd like to do more. So if you'd like to engage with us, we are small but we are keen. Get in touch with us. We have your email addresses, you now have ours as well. Get in touch with us. Let's meet, let's have a coffee, let's have a chat, and let's figure out what we can do together, because it's not an issue that's going away, and it's a complex and non-party political issue, and we're very non-party political. We just want to find good solutions for things, and think tanks can be useful in this space where sometimes the politics gets in the way. So keep talking to us and keep coming to our events, and thank you, Paul, for all of that tonight. Hope you're not too bruised by some of it, and thank you very much.
No, generally, and the offer's out there. I'd say to offer it to meet people. That's an offer. If you want to catch me, please drop me an email and I'll fit in my diary. Private office might be going crazy when I'm saying that, but please drop me an email. I've met a lot of people around the table, around here tonight. Happy to catch up with anybody, because it is these guys are the experts in the sector. I need to learn from that and adapt to what we need to do.
And he's got 2 years, so
and I've got 7. Maybe I would say
Time off for good behaviour.
2 anyway.
Only.
And I'm only 25. Look at me. So,
thanks very much, everyone.